Have you ever wondered why it seems like your life is so complicated? As if everything were going wrong or stopped in time? Don't worry, this could be more than just a coincidence. It could be God preparing you for something incredible. Today, I'm going to show you 15 powerful signs that indicate He is shaping your path to something great. And the last sign? It is the most important of all, and can change your outlook on the challenges you face now. Don't blink, because every second of this video can transform your spiritual journey. Have you ever had those moments when it seems like everything around you is silent, as if the answers you were looking for simply weren't arriving? It's like talking to someone, but not hearing any response from the other side. This can be frustrating, even desperate, but you know what? This silence may not be what you think. Sometimes God is silent not because He has abandoned you, but because He is watching you very closely. He is molding you like a sculptor who, in silence, works on the smallest details of his work. It may seem like you are alone, but believe me, He is there, right by your side, watching every step you take. Just imagine a father who teaches his son to ride a bicycle without training wheels. At first he holds on tight, but at some point he lets go of his hands, standing just behind, ready to support any stumble. The child may feel like he is alone, but the father never left. This is how God is in silence. He may seem distant, but He is watching you, waiting for the right moment to intervene. He knows that if you talk all the time, you'll never learn to pedal through life alone. This silence is actually an act of love. God wants you to trust not what you hear, but what you believe. David, one of the greatest kings in biblical history, also faced this silence. In Psalm 13, he cries, "How long, Lord? Will you forget me forever?" It's a deep outburst, full of pain. But what happened next? David understood that silence was preparation, not abandonment. God was building in David a confidence that did not depend on immediate signs, but on a solid and unshakable faith. It was this confidence that made him the leader he needed to be. When God seems silent, He is actually writing the most important chapters of your story. Think of it like a test at school. During the test, the teacher does not speak, does not answer questions, or gives tips. He sits there silent, just watching the student apply what he has learned. God does the same. He stays quiet because it is at this moment that He evaluates your patience, your faith, and how much you trust in the teachings He has already given you. So, when you feel like heaven is closed, remember, God is preparing something. He is molding your soul, strengthening your spirit, and adjusting your heart for something you can't even imagine right now. Now imagine what it must have been like for David, the future king of Israel, to go through a long period of divine silence. He had already been chosen by God, anointed by the prophet Samuel, but his life was far from easy. David faced persecution, lived as a fugitive, and hid in caves. He cried out to God, but often what he found was a silence that seemed unbearable. In Psalm 13 he asks, "How long, Lord? Will you forget me forever? How long will you hide your face from me?" It is impossible not to feel the weight of these words. David was exhausted, insecure, and even desperate, but what David didn't know at that moment was that God was molding in him the heart of a leader. This silence served to strengthen him, to teach him what it meant to trust God completely, even when there were no visible signs that everything would work out. He learned to walk in faith, not by what he saw or heard, but by what he believed. This silence, which seemed so painful, was, in fact, the ground where God was planting seeds of courage, patience, and dependence. And you may wonder, why would God allow this? Because leaders like David, used for great purposes, need to be prepared in a special way. During those years of persecution and silence, David developed the humility of a servant and the strength of a warrior. God knew exactly what He was doing. What looked like abandonment was actually divine care, adjusting every detail of David's character so that he could fulfill the purpose to which he was called. This story shows us that when we face silence and difficulties, it is not because God has forgotten us. He is preparing us for something greater. He is strengthening our faith, just as he did with David. The silence that now seems empty could be the prelude to something extraordinary. So if today you feel like you are in the middle of deafening silence, remember David's journey. God is working, even if you can't see it yet. And do you know why silence is so important? Because it is in him that our faith truly grows. Just as a tree needs deep roots to survive storms, our faith needs times of drought to take deeper root. In the silence, God is calling us to trust not in what we feel or see, but in who he is. It is an invitation to be steadfast, even when the circumstances around us seem to test us. Think of a tree planted in dry soil. In search of water, its roots go deeper, spread out further. In the end, she becomes stronger and more resilient. In the same way, God's silence challenges us to seek more of him, to depend more on him, and to find in him the strength we need. This process can be uncomfortable, but the result is spiritual growth that prepares us to face the biggest storms. God's silence also teaches us patience, a virtue most of us struggle to develop. We live in a world of instant gratification, where we want everything now. But God does not work according to our clock. He uses these moments to teach us to wait, to trust his timing and his plan. Just as Joseph waited years in prison before seeing his dreams come true, we too need to learn to wait, trusting that God is orchestrating something much bigger. And when does this silence finally end? It finds us stronger, more confident, and more prepared for the challenges to come. God's silence is not a pause in our lives. It is the moment when he is building something great within us. It may be painful while it happens, but when you look back, you will realize that it was in that silence that God planted the roots that sustain your faith to this day. After experiencing silence and understanding that God is working behind the scenes, we often experience something even more disconcerting. Our plans begin to fall apart. Have you been through this? You do everything, you put your heart into it, you invest time, and it seems that in the end, nothing works out. But what if I told you that this could be a sign that God is redirecting your life? Sometimes what we interpret as failure is actually God's finger, pulling us away from something that isn't best for us. Joseph, for example, had incredible dreams given by God himself. He saw his brothers bowing before him and believed that something great awaited him. But what happened? He was sold into slavery, unjustly imprisoned and forgotten for years. To human eyes, it seemed that Joseph's destiny had been destroyed. But in the silence of that prison, God was writing a much bigger story. The apparent detour was, in fact, the path that would lead him to become governor of Egypt. And what about our own deviations? How? Many times do we cling to something that seems ideal, but God, with his infinite vision, pushes us down a path that we initially don't understand? Think of it like walking a mountain trail. You start in one direction, but the trail suddenly changes. It can be frustrating, but as you follow it, you realize that the new route takes you to a much more beautiful view. God does the same. He redirects our steps so that we can achieve what has truly been prepared for us. These redirections can be painful, especially when they involve giving up something we value. But God never takes away without offering something better in return. He knows the end of the story, even when we can only see the current chapter. If your plans have failed, perhaps it is time to ask, Lord, where are you leading me? Because just like with Joseph, the path that seems confusing today could be the path to the purpose that God prepared especially for you. And what can we learn from Joseph's journey? Imagine the shock he must have felt when, full of dreams and promises, he was betrayed by his own brothers, sold into slavery and taken to a strange place. He could have easily given up everything. But Joseph trusted that God had a purpose, even when events seemed to indicate otherwise. He accepted the redirection as part of the divine plan, even without understanding why. After years as a slave and later a prisoner, Joseph had a turnaround that no one expected. He interpreted Pharaoh's dreams and was elevated to the position of governor, saving not only Egypt, but his own family from famine. What seemed like the end to Joseph was actually the beginning of God's perfect plan. God turned betrayal and pain into a story of redemption and purpose, something Joseph could never have planned on his own. What makes this story so powerful is Joseph's example of faith and resilience. He did not let himself be consumed by resentment or self-pity. He trusted that even in the most difficult circumstances, God was in control. This trust was the key for him to remain steadfast, allowing God to shape him for something greater. God used every difficulty to prepare Joseph for a role that would change the destiny of an entire nation. And you, have you ever thought that your failures could be the building blocks for something great? Just like Joseph, you may not understand now why you are facing so many difficulties. But God wastes no tears, no effort. It turns everything into part of the purpose. Even if today you are in the well, remember, God has plans that you cannot yet imagine, but which, as in the story of Joseph, will exceed all your expectations. After understanding how God redirects our plans, we are often faced with something equally challenging: resistance. Have you ever noticed that the more determined you are to do something right, the more obstacles appear in your path? It's like everything around you is trying to stop you. But you know what's amazing? These barriers, as difficult as they may seem, are actually signs that you are exactly where you are supposed to be. Great purposes rarely come without great challenges. Nehemiah is a perfect example of this. He was given the mission to rebuild the walls of Jerusalem, but it was not easy. From the beginning, he faced ridicule, threats, and even conspiracies to prevent his work. His enemies tried to discourage him in every way, but Nehemiah did not back down. He responded with prayer, planning, and perseverance. He continued the work with one hand on the job and the other on the sword, prepared to defend his mission. God was with him, and the walls were completed. These oppositions that we encounter in our own lives can have the same purpose: to strengthen us. Just as fire refines gold, endurance refines our character and faith. God allows us to face these challenges so that we can grow, becoming stronger and more dependent on Him. Every criticism, every closed door, is an opportunity to learn to trust God in a deeper way. It's not the easy moments that shape us, but the difficult ones. And if the resistance is there, maybe it's because the purpose you carry is great. Just like Nehemiah, you may be building something that will have a greater impact than you realize. Instead of getting discouraged, use this resistance as confirmation that you are on the right path. God doesn't allow us to face anything we can't handle, and He never lets us fight alone. Each barrier overcome is a victory that brings you even closer to His plan. The story of Nehemiah remains a powerful example of how to deal with opposition. When he began rebuilding the walls, his enemies wasted no time. They ridiculed him, saying that the stones he used would not resist. But Nehemiah knew something they didn't. He wasn't working alone. He prayed constantly, asking God for strength and wisdom. For Nehemiah, work was not just physical, it was spiritual. And when the threats intensified, Nehemiah did not give up. He took practical measures, such as dividing the people into groups. While some worked, others protected the work. This teaches us that trusting God does not mean ignoring dangers, but facing them with wisdom and courage. Nehemiah was a man of action, but also a man of prayer, and this combination was essential in overcoming opposition. His enemies tried everything to intimidate him. They even planned traps to keep him away from the work. However, Nehemiah remained focused. He knew his mission was greater than any threat. With this, he shows us that opposition is not a sign to stop, but an opportunity to persevere. When God puts something in your heart, no criticism or attack can erase that purpose. It is He who sustains you. And when the walls were completed, the victory was not just for Nehemiah, but for the people who trusted God and worked in unity. This story is a reminder that even when everything seems to be against you, God is for you. The resistance you face could be the push you need to take you even further. So, if today you feel like the world is pressuring you, remember Nehemiah. God is the one who gives you the strength to continue and complete what He started in you. After facing resistance and realizing that God is strengthening you, sometimes you find yourself in an even more challenging place, the spiritual desert. Have you ever had that feeling that no matter how much you pray or read the Bible, everything seems dry and distant? The desert is not only a place of difficulty, but also a space where God transforms who we are. He does not take us into the desert to punish us, but to prepare us. The desert is where God works in silence, far from the distractions and comfortable comforts of everyday life. It is there that He teaches us lessons that we would not learn otherwise. Think about Jesus, who before beginning His ministry was led into the desert for 40 days. He faced hunger, loneliness, and temptations, but He came out stronger, prepared to fulfill His mission. The desert is not the end. It is the place where God builds something new within us. And just like Jesus, other great biblical figures also passed through the desert. Moses, for example, lived 40 years tending sheep in an arid land before being called to free Israel. During this time, God molded in him the humility and dependence necessary to lead an entire nation. The desert may seem like a place of abandonment, but it is, in fact, a space of transformation. If you are going through a period like this, where everything seems difficult and lifeless, know that God is using this moment to teach you. In the desert, we are confronted with our fears and weaknesses, and it is there that we learn to depend completely on God. He doesn't want you to stay in that place forever, but He wants you to leave there stronger, more confident, and prepared for the next steps. And who better to teach us about the desert than Moses? Imagine spending 40 years living as a shepherd in a desolate land. Moses had grown up in the palace of Egypt, surrounded by luxury and power, but God took him out of there and took him to the desert. At first, it must have been confusing and even frustrating for him. After all, how could that place be part of a bigger plan? But God knew what He was doing. He used each day in the wilderness to shape Moses' character. In solitude, Moses learned to hear the voice of God. By tending sheep, he developed the patience and humility he would need to lead a stubborn people like Israel. The desert was a place of preparation, and Moses only understood this later when God called him to free the people. And when the moment came, Moses was ready. He had been trained in the silence of the desert to face Pharaoh and lead God's people on an even more challenging journey. The same place that seemed insignificant became the stage of divine revelation. It was there that Moses saw the burning bush and heard God's call, a reminder that He never forgets us even in the most desolate places. Like Moses, perhaps you are in a desert right now, not understanding the purpose of it all. But God sees beyond. He is using every experience to shape something greater in you. The desert is not a punishment, but a place where God prepares your heart to face greater challenges. And when the call comes, you will be ready, just like Moses was. Once we understand the purpose of the desert and how it transforms who we are, something begins to change deep within. Those are priorities. Have you ever noticed how, at certain moments, things that previously seemed essential suddenly lose their luster? God often changes our priorities to teach us to focus on what really matters, leaving aside what is temporary to seek the eternal. A powerful example of this is in the story of Abraham. God asked something seemingly impossible, that he sacrifice Isaac, his beloved son, the living promise of God in his life. Imagine Abraham's internal struggle. Isaac represented Not only divine blessing, but all of his dreams and hopes. But God didn't want to take Isaac away from him. He wanted to see where Abraham's heart was. He needed to know whether Abraham valued the blessing or the blesser more. And Abraham passed the test. God sometimes touches areas that we consider untouchable. It could be your career, your relationships, or even something simple that you have placed at the center of your life. He does this to show us that only He should occupy the first place in our hearts. Just as a house built on sand cannot withstand storms, our priorities need to be aligned with God so that we can withstand life's challenges. When you feel uncomfortable or notice that God is changing something in your life, that is not punishment. It's an invitation to reevaluate what really matters. He wants you to be willing to let go of what is fleeting, to embrace what is eternal. This process, although difficult, reveals what is in your heart and aligns your priorities with the divine plan, preparing you for something much greater. And that's exactly what happened to Abraham. When God asked for Isaac, Abraham knew it was more than just a test. It was an opportunity to demonstrate his faith and obedience. He prepared everything: the wood, the altar, the path to the mountain. Each step must have been a gigantic emotional struggle, but he didn't hesitate. Deep down, Abraham trusted that God had a greater purpose, even if he didn't understand it at the time. And at the last moment, when Abraham was about to sacrifice Isaac, God intervened. He provided a ram for the sacrifice, confirming that the goal was never to take anything from Abraham, but rather to test his heart. Abraham showed that his trust was in God above all else, and this act of faith echoes to this day as an example of total surrender to the divine plan. This story teaches us that God never asks us for something without having a greater purpose behind it. When He calls us to give up something, it is not because He wants to deprive us, but because He wants to take us to a place of greater intimacy with Him. Abraham did not lose Isaac. On the contrary, he gained an even more unshakable faith and confirmation that God is faithful. And maybe you are facing something similar. It may not be a literal sacrifice, but a change in priorities that requires trust and commitment. Remember, God always has a purpose. Just like Abraham, when you put God first, He does extraordinary things. It's not about what you leave behind, but about what God is preparing to give you up front. Once we understand that God shifts our priorities to align us with His purpose, He often leads us through an even deeper test, that of scarcity. Have you ever experienced a time when it seemed like there weren't enough resources? It could be money, opportunities, or even emotional strengths. These seasons can be scary, but God uses them to teach us valuable lessons about dependence and trusting Him. Think of the widow of Zarephath, who lived in the midst of great drought and famine. She had only a handful of flour and some olive oil, enough for one last meal for her and her son before they faced death from starvation. When the prophet Elijah appeared, she was challenged to something unimaginable: use what was left to make him some bread first. This took an absurd amount of faith, but she obeyed. The result? God multiplied the little she had, sustaining her throughout the time of scarcity. Scarcity forces us to look beyond what we see with human eyes and trust in what God can do. It is at this moment that we learn that divine provision does not depend on how much we have, but on how much we trust. The lesson here is not about quantity, but about delivery. Just as the widow gave up the little she had, we are challenged to trust that God can turn a little into a lot. And you know what's amazing? When you face scarcity with faith, you learn to value each provision as a gift from God. He not only meets your needs, but also molds your heart to see His hands in every detail. It may seem like a time of limitation, but it is actually an opportunity to see the power of God working in your life. And when you're living in scarcity, it's natural for another challenge to arise, the temptation to give up. You know that urge to drop everything and say, "That's enough, I can't take it anymore." This temptation may seem like a sign of failure, but it is actually proof of the importance of your mission. The greater the purpose, the greater the pressure to abandon it. Jonas is a clear example of this. God gave him a mission to preach in Nineveh, a city full of evil. But instead of obeying, Jonas fled. He didn't want to take on the challenge, which led him into a storm, being swallowed by a large fish, and ultimately reconsidering his mission. Jonah's escape teaches us that God does not give up on us, even when we are tempted to give up on him or our calling. This temptation also appeared in the life of Jeremiah. He was constantly rejected and persecuted by his own people. There were moments when Jeremiah wanted to stop, but something inside him pushed him to continue. He described it as a fire burning in his bones that could not be contained. This fire was God's purpose, which overcame any discouragement or opposition. When you feel like abandoning the mission, it could be a sign that you are very close to something big. It is at this time that God calls you to trust him more and less in your strengths. He doesn't expect you to face everything alone. Just as Jonah was redirected and Jeremiah was renewed, God gives you what you need to continue, even in the most difficult times. After facing the temptation to abandon the mission, something even more subtle can happen: the test of success. It seems strange, doesn't it? But sometimes the moments of greatest fulfillment and prosperity can become dangerous traps if we don't keep our hearts in the right place. When everything starts to go right, it's easy to forget who each blessing came from and make the mistake of depending more on our achievements than on God. King Solomon is a striking example of this. When God asked what he wanted, Solomon asked for wisdom to govern the people. God was so pleased with the request that he gave him, in addition to wisdom, incomparable riches and honor. In the beginning, Solomon used these blessings to glorify God by building the temple and leading righteously. But over time, he strayed. His riches and political alliances led him to worship other gods, forgetting the commitment he had made to the Lord. This detour teaches us that success, however tempting, can be as difficult a test as scarcity. When we are at the top, we are challenged to remain humble and remember that everything we have comes from God. As it is written in Deuteronomy 8:18, "Remember the Lord your God, for it is he who gives you the ability to produce wealth." Success should be a reason to redouble our dependence on God, not to move away from him. The true test of success is how we use our blessings. Do they bring us closer or further away from God? Solomon shows us that without vigilance we can lose focus. But when we keep God at the center, success becomes a powerful tool for blessing others and fulfilling his purpose in our lives. This is the invitation that success brings. Keep your heart anchored in the source and not in the result. And even when we achieve success or overcome challenges, there are times when God pushes us to the limit. These times can be emotionally exhausting, but they are also the times that most reveal his strength in our weakness. Have you ever felt like you couldn't take another step? As if you are carrying a weight that seems impossible to bear? This is the moment when God shows that when we reach our end, he is just beginning. The Apostle Paul lived this intensely. He described a thorn in the flesh, something that deeply troubled him and from which he asked to be free. But God answered, "My grace is sufficient for you, for my power is made perfect in weakness." 2 Corinthians 12:9. God did not remove the problem, but he gave Paul the strength he needed to endure it. Sometimes God pushes us to the limit to remind us that we don't need to trust in our own abilities, but in his grace and power. Another example is Elijah, who, after defeating the prophets of Baal on Mount Carmel, found himself completely exhausted and fled into the desert. He asked God to take his life, believing his mission was over, but in his darkest hour, God sustained him. He sent food, rest, and a new vision to Elijah, showing that there was still much to be done. God not only lifts up what has fallen, but renews the strength to continue. When God takes you to the limit, it's because he wants to show you that you're not alone. It is in these moments that we learn to surrender control completely to Him, just as gold is refined in fire. These periods make us stronger, more dependent on God, and more prepared for the purpose He has for us. And when we cross that threshold, we realize that His power has always been enough, even when we thought we couldn't do it anymore. After understanding that God can take us to the limit to shape us, there is another test that often goes unnoticed: the test of humility in small tasks. God observes how we react when He entrusts us with something that, in the eyes of the world, seems insignificant. It is in these situations that He reveals the true state of our hearts. Are we willing to serve with joy, even when no one is watching or applauding? David is a perfect example of this. Before becoming king, he was just a sheep herder. While his brothers were on the battlefield, David was alone, tending his family's flock. This might seem like an unimportant job, but it was there, in the silence of the fields, that God began to shape the heart of a leader. He learned to protect the sheep from lions and bears, developing courage and loyalty that would later be essential on his journey. These little tasks that God gives us are not useless. They are training. Jesus Himself said, "He who is faithful in a little is also faithful in much," Luke 16:10. When we are faithful in what seems small, God prepares us for greater things. He wants to see if our hearts are more concerned with service or recognition. It is in the little that He shapes our humility so that we are ready when much arrives. And maybe today you feel like this, in charge of something that seems small or irrelevant. But remember, every step is part of God's plan. Small tasks are opportunities to demonstrate dedication and faith. They teach us to value the process and not just the result. And when we are faithful in them, God opens doors to something greater, just as He did with David, who left the fields to govern a nation. And the story of David as a shepherd shows us how much God uses the moments that seem simplest to prepare us for something great. Imagine David in the middle of the fields, away from the spotlight, facing the boredom of tending sheep. He could have asked himself, "Why did God put me here? Does this have any purpose?" But in reality, God was molding in him skills and character that would be crucial to his future mission. While pastoring, David developed the courage necessary to face greater challenges. He didn't run away from threats, but he faced lions and bears to protect the herd. This courage was what led him to face Goliath with such confidence. He knew that just as God had helped him protect the sheep, God would also help him defeat the giant. Every moment on the field was a silent preparation for the great challenges to come. Furthermore, as a shepherd, David learned to care for others. Before leading a nation, he needed to learn how to lead a flock. This care, this patience, and this dedication were fundamental for him to become the king that God wanted. David did not despise time in the fields, and this made him a leader after God's own heart. He understood that serving in something small is an honor when we are serving God. And maybe you're in your own field right now, in a place that seems far from your dreams or the purpose you feel God has for you. But remember, God is using this time to prepare you. Just like David, every little challenge you face today is shaping the leader, servant, or instrument God needs for the future. Nothing is in vain when it is God who leads the process. After understanding how God works in our lives in small and seemingly insignificant tasks, there are times when He takes us into something even deeper: isolation. Have you ever had the feeling of being completely alone, even when surrounded by people? These seasons may seem scary, but they are often the times when God does His greatest works in us. He takes us out of the hustle and bustle so we can hear His voice clearly. Elijah went through exactly this. After a great victory on Mount Carmel, where he defeated the prophets of Baal, Elijah entered a moment of deep loneliness. Fleeing into the desert, he felt exhausted, discouraged, and even asked God to take his life. He believed he was alone and that his mission was over. But it was in that isolation that God met him in a unique way. not in an earthquake or fire, but in a gentle whisper, showing that even in moments of loneliness, he is present. Isolation forces us to face ourselves and our limitations. Without the distractions of the world, God works in areas we might otherwise ignore. He uses this time to refine us, reveal hidden motivations, and prepare our hearts for something greater. Just like Elijah, sometimes we need to be taken out of the crowd to understand that our strength does not come from us, but from God. If today you feel like you are in an emotional or spiritual desert, know that God is not absent. He is inviting you into a deeper, more intimate relationship. Isolation can be the place where you discover truths about yourself and God that you would never see through the noise. It is not a place of abandonment, but of transformation. And Elijah's experience in isolation teaches us a lot about how God acts in these moments. When Elijah fled into the desert, he believed his mission was over. He felt the weight of being alone and thought there was no one else by his side. But God did not abandon him. On the contrary, he sustained Elijah in surprising ways. First, he sent an angel to feed him and give him strength. Afterwards, he guided Elijah to Mount Horeb, where he would have a transformative encounter with him. It was in the silence of the mountain that Elijah heard something that changed his perspective. God did not manifest himself in grandiose phenomena such as strong winds, earthquakes, or fire. Instead, he spoke in a soft whisper. This lesson is powerful. God does not always act spectacularly. Often, he reveals himself in silence, in the small moments when we are willing to listen to him with an open heart. Elijah also discovered that he was not as alone as he thought. God revealed to him that there were still 7,000 in Israel who had not bowed the knee to Baal. This reminder that we are not alone, even in our darkest moments, is something we all need to hear. God always has a plan, and he never leaves us without direction, even when we feel lost. If you feel isolated today, remember Elijah. God uses these moments to renew our strength, adjust our vision, and remind us that he is in control. Just as Elijah left the desert with new purpose and strength to continue his mission, God is also preparing you for what comes next. Isolation is just the setting where God works most intimately and powerfully in our lives. After exploring how God shapes us in isolation, we face another challenge that tests our faith in profound ways: injustice. Who has never felt wronged, treated wrongly, or accused without reason? In these moments, our first reaction is to want to defend our honor or even fight back. But God calls us to something different, trusting him to do justice while remaining firm and silent. This posture requires strength that does not come from ourselves, but from absolute trust in God. David is a notable example of this. For years, he was persecuted by King Saul, who was jealous of him and feared losing the throne. Even though he knew he was God's anointed to be king, David chose not to retaliate. On one occasion, he had the perfect chance to finish off Saul, but he chose to spare his life. David said, "The Lord keep me from doing such a thing to my master, the Lord's anointed." 1 Samuel 24:6. He knew that justice was not his responsibility, but God's. This choice not to react was not weakness, but a demonstration of confidence and humility. David believed that God was in control of all things and that at the right time he would fulfill his promises. By not taking justice into his own hands, David showed that his faith did not depend on circumstances, but on the character of God. He knew that God was faithful and just, even when everything around him seemed otherwise. When we face injustice, God invites us to trust him to handle the situation. It is an exercise in faith and submission. It is not easy to remain silent when everything within us cries out for justice. But it is in these moments that we show where our confidence lies. Like David, we can rest in the certainty that God sees everything and acts in perfect time, bringing justice in a way that only he can do. Facing injustice without reacting is a test that requires emotional control and mental strength. But what about when the challenges seem never-ending and we feel overwhelmed? This is the test of mental and emotional endurance, a moment when God leads us to face what we believe to be our limits. At these times, we discover that true strength is not in ourselves, but in God. Job is a classic example of this test. He lost everything, his wealth, his health, and even his children. Furthermore, he was constantly accused by friends who said that he must have done something wrong to deserve so much suffering. Still, Job kept his faith. He declared, "Though he slay me, yet will I hope in him." Job 13:15. This unshakable trust in God is what inspires us to resist, even when it seems like we no longer have the strength to continue. The Apostle Paul also faced emotional and mental challenges. He was arrested, beaten, persecuted, and on many occasions felt pressured beyond his strength. But he declared, "On every side we are pressed, but not discouraged. We are perplexed, but not in despair." 2 Corinthians 4:8. Paul understood that even when he seemed to be at his limit, God was his source of renewal and strength. These difficult moments teach us to trust God in a deeper way. When we are pushed to the limit, we learn that our strength does not come from us, but from those who are by our side. Just like Job and Paul, we can find in God the peace and courage necessary to continue, even when the weight seems unbearable. This test is an invitation to be renewed by Him and to be strengthened in the midst of adversity. After facing mental and emotional resistance, a test arises that directly challenges our faith. Generosity in times of scarcity. Have you ever noticed how difficult it is to be generous when it seems like we barely have enough for ourselves? However, God often calls us to share what little we have, not because He needs what we give, but because He wants to work something deep in our hearts. Sarepta's widow lived this experience intensely. During a severe drought, she had only a handful of flour and a little olive oil, enough to prepare the last meal for her and her son. It was at this critical moment that Elijah asked her to prepare some bread for him first. Imagine the dilemma. She could choose to feed her family or trust the word of the prophet. Against all odds, she chose faith. God honored this choice, multiplying the flour and oil, ensuring that nothing was missing throughout the drought. This test shows us that generosity does not depend on abundance, but on faith. When we are challenged to give, even in scarcity, it is an opportunity to prove that we trust God's provision. He never calls us to share without first having a plan to meet our needs. The act of giving in difficult times is not just a selfless gesture. It is a spiritual exercise that strengthens our dependence on Him. Maybe you are facing something similar right now. It may feel like you don't have enough, but God is calling you to trust. He doesn't want to leave you with nothing. He wants to teach you that when we trust in Him, the little we have can become more than enough. Just as with the widow of Zarephath, God uses our generosity as a channel to reveal His power and faithfulness. After passing the generosity test, another challenge may arise: the temptation to look for shortcuts. When we face difficulties or feel that God's promises are taking time to be fulfilled, it is easy to think of alternatives that seem quicker or easier. But these shortcuts often take us away from God's original purpose and place us in even more complicated situations. Abraham and Sarah faced this temptation. God had promised that they would have a child, but years passed and nothing happened. Impatient, they decided to take control of the situation. Sarah suggested that Abraham have a child with her servant Hagar. The plan worked, but it brought a series of conflicts and complications to his family. God fulfilled His promise at the right time with the birth of Isaac, but the shortcut chosen by Abraham and Sarah brought consequences that could have been avoided. This story teaches us that, even when waiting is difficult, it is better to trust in God's timing than to look for shortcuts. These alternative paths may seem like quick fixes, but they often divert us from the original plan. When we try to force something on our own, we run the risk of creating problems that God never intended for us. Patience is essential to trust that God is working, even when we don't see immediate results. If you are facing this temptation right now, remember that God is faithful. He is not late, and His promises are always fulfilled on time. Looking for shortcuts may seem like a momentary solution, but trusting God is the only path that brings lasting peace and results that truly reflect His perfect plan for your life. After resisting the temptation to look for shortcuts, God can put us to an even more challenging test: obedience in situations that seem unusual or even illogical. Have you ever had to make a decision that didn't make sense to human eyes, but that seemed to be exactly what God was asking you to do? This is the kind of obedience that takes us out of our comfort zone and tests our faith like never before. Noah is a striking example of this type of obedience. God told him to build an ark at a time when it had never rained on earth. Imagine the scenario: Noah chopping wood, working for years, while the people around him mocked and questioned his sanity. But Noah did not argue or ask for explanations. He simply obeyed. And when the flood came, it was his faith and obedience that saved his family and ensured the continuity of humanity. This type of obedience is not easy because it requires us to trust God above our own logic or understanding. Often, circumstances do not seem favorable, and the people around us can discourage us. But it is precisely in these moments that we demonstrate how much we trust in God. He doesn't call us to understand everything, but to obey, even when it doesn't make sense. If God is asking you something that seems unusual, remember Noah. His obedience brought protection and blessing not only to him, but to many. Likewise, when we follow God's instructions, even without fully understanding them, we are planting the seeds for a future that only He can see. It is in obedience that we find purpose and align ourselves with the divine plan. And if obedience in unusual situations is challenging enough, imagine being called to give something that is deeply precious to you. This is the test of faith in sacrifice, one of the most crucial moments in our journey with God. He asks us to lay something we love on the altar, not to deprive ourselves, but to reveal where our heart really is. It is a test of faith that goes far beyond what we can imagine. Abraham faced this literally. God asked him to sacrifice Isaac, his son, the living promise that he would be the father of a great nation. Abraham could have questioned, hesitated, or even refused, but he chose to obey. He went up to the mountain with Isaac, preparing the altar and the wood, without knowing how God would resolve the situation. The most memorable moment was when Abraham raised the knife, and God intervened, providing a ram in Isaac's place. This act of faith demonstrated that Abraham trusted that God was able to fulfill His promises even in the most difficult circumstances. This type of proof is not easy. Sacrificing something we value requires complete trust in God's character. He does not want to take from us, but to teach us to place everything in His hands. When we are willing to give up what we love most, we show that our faith is not in the blessings, but in the blesser. Abraham did not lose Isaac. He gained a deeper faith and an even closer relationship with God. And perhaps you are facing such a test right now. It may not be as extreme as Abraham's, but God may be asking you to trust Him in a way that seems scary. Remember that He is a God of provision. When we surrender everything to Him, we do not lose. We are renewed. Sacrifice, when guided by God, is always the path to something much greater than we can imagine. After passing the test of sacrifice, another important challenge may arise: the trial in our relationships. These moments deeply test our character and our ability to love as God loves, especially when we face conflict or are hurt by those close to us. Have you ever been in a situation where someone you trusted deeply disappointed you? God often uses these situations to shape us, teaching us about forgiveness, patience, and humility. Jose experienced one of the most intense trials in this regard. betrayed by his own brothers who sold him into slavery. He spent years facing injustice and loneliness. When he finally had the chance to retaliate by becoming governor of Egypt, Joseph did something surprising. Instead of taking revenge, he chose to forgive. Upon meeting his brothers again, he said, "You intended evil against me, but God meant it for good." Genesis 50:20. Joseph saw the hand of God in the midst of pain, allowing it to transform his heart. These tests in our relationships are not easy because they directly touch our emotions. It's natural to want to protect ourselves or to reciprocate in kind, but God calls us to a higher path, loving those who hurt us. Jesus taught this radically when he said, "Love your enemies and pray for those who persecute you." Matthew 5:44. This attitude is not about approving of the evil done to us, but about trusting God to bring justice as we choose the path of love. If you are experiencing conflict or hurt in a relationship, see this as an opportunity to grow spiritually. These tests are not just about the other person. They are about how God is working in you. Just like Joseph, God can use these trials to redeem difficult situations and bring about something greater than you could ever imagine. Forgiveness and reconciliation not only frees the other, but also frees us to move forward in God's purpose. And as we deal with these challenges in relationships, there are times when we face another kind of test: inner silence. Have you ever felt like you couldn't hear God's voice, even though you were searching with all your might? This silence can be unsettling, making us question whether we are on the right path or even whether God is still with us. But this period is not an absence of God. It is an invitation to dive deeper into his presence. David experienced this silence at different times in his life. In Psalm 22, he cries, my God, why have you forsaken me?" It's a plea that resonates with many of us in our moments of spiritual loneliness. However, even in the midst of this feeling, David never lost his confidence. He continued to declare God's faithfulness, knowing that even in the silence, God was still acting. This period of inner silence is like a pause in a melody. Sometimes, it's in the interval between notes that the music becomes most meaningful. God uses these moments to teach us to trust him more deeply without relying on signs or emotions. It's a lesson in pure faith, where we learn to rest in the certainty that he is faithful, even when we don't feel his presence in a tangible way. If you are going through this silence right now, remember that God is not far away. He is calling you to trust, not in what you feel, but in what you know about who he is. These moments of silence are not empty. They are full of purpose. They strengthen us and prepare us for the next steps, just as happened with David, who emerged from the silence with an even firmer faith. After the inner silence, we are led to another test: patience as we wait for the fulfillment of God's purpose. Ever feel like you've been waiting too long? That the promises seem distant and the paths slow? This test is not easy, but it is an opportunity for God to work in our hearts and prepare us for what is to come. Joseph is a clear example of how God uses waiting to shape our character. He was given a dream at a young age, but it took years to see it come to fruition. During this time, he faced slavery, prison, and oblivion. But Joseph did not let the delay erase his trust in God. He remained faithful even without knowing when or how his dreams would come true. When the time was right, Joseph was prepared to assume the position of governor of Egypt and save many lives. Waiting often reveals where our heart is. She teaches us to trust God's timing and not our own. As Ecclesiastes 3:11 says, God made everything beautiful in its due time. While we wait, he is working behind the scenes, aligning people, circumstances, and opportunities. Patience allows us to rest in the certainty that God is sovereign and that he is never late. If you feel like you are stuck in a period of waiting, know that God is preparing you. Just like with Jose, the waiting time is not wasted. It is a time of growth, confidence, and preparation. God not only keeps his promises, he also prepares us to receive them in the right way. Patience is the key to experiencing God's perfect plan. Perseverance is a virtue that sustains us in moments when it seems impossible to continue. When we follow the journey with God, we are not promised that the path will be without difficulties, but we are assured that he will be by our side at every step. Persevering is not simply resisting, is moving forward, even when circumstances seem to say we should give up. It is in these moments of adversity that our faith is refined, and we learn to depend more on God than on our own strength. In the Bible, we find countless examples of perseverance in the face of almost unbearable challenges. One of the most notable is that of Paul, who faced arrests, shipwrecks, beatings, and constant persecution. Yet he declared with conviction, "I have fought the good fight, I have finished the race, I have kept the faith." 2 Timothy 4:7. Paul's strength did not come from his own ability, but from his trust in God, who gave him the courage to move forward even when the winds were contrary. Persevering also means staying focused on the purpose God has placed in our lives. Many times, adversities are used by God to strengthen us and shape our character, just as fire refines gold. Every obstacle we face is an opportunity to grow in faith and trust in Him. Like Nehemiah, who rebuilt the walls of Jerusalem amid mockery and threats, we need to remember that the work God has placed in our hands is greater than any opposition. When we recognize this, we find the strength to continue. A perseverance teaches us that victory does not depend on the absence of struggles, but on the presence of God in each battle. When challenges come, remember that God is greater than any adversity. He not only gives you the strength to resist, but empowers you to move forward with faith and determination. Persevering is trusting that even in the midst of storms, there is a greater purpose being fulfilled in your life, and at the right time, you will see the fruits of this journey of faith. Nehemiah is a powerful example of how perseverance, combined with faith, can keep us firm in the face of the greatest adversity. He had a clear, God-given mission to rebuild the walls of Jerusalem, a symbol of the protection and restoration of God's people. However, from the beginning, Nehemiah faced fierce opposition. Enemies laughed at him, discredited his mission, and even conspired to stop his work. Despite all this, Nehemiah did not allow criticism or threats to divert him from his purpose. He kept his eyes fixed on God and the task before him. One of Nehemiah's most striking phrases, "I am engaged in a great work, and I cannot come down," Nehemiah 6:3, reflects his unwavering determination. He understood that his mission was greater than any distraction or attack. This statement teaches us that when we know we are accomplishing something God has called us to do, we need to prioritize that purpose above the voices that try to discourage us. Nehemiah not only ignored the naysayers, but continued working, showing that perseverance is also an action and not just a passive attitude. Nehemiah's trust in God was what sustained his perseverance. In moments of danger or doubt, he turned to prayer, seeking strength and direction. He knew that no matter how challenging the task, he was not alone. God was by his side, ensuring that the mission would be accomplished. Nehemiah's continued dependence on God is an essential lesson for all of us. The battles we face in our journey of faith are not overcome with human effort alone, but with the conviction that God is with us, guiding and strengthening at every step. Nehemiah's example challenges us to remain steadfast in our own missions. Just like him, we can face ridicule, criticism, and even direct opposition. But when we trust God and stay focused on what He has called us to do, we can overcome any obstacle. No matter how difficult the journey may seem, commitment to the divine mission and perseverance in the midst of difficulties will lead us to fulfill the purpose for which we were called. Adversity is often a divine training ground where God molds our character and strengthens our faith. Although it is natural to think that difficulties indicate a mistake in the path, they are often signs that we are right in the center of God's will. When we face trials, we are invited to rely less on our own strength and more on God's sustaining grace. He uses these situations not to destroy us, but to build us up, transforming obstacles into stepping stones to our spiritual growth. Paul, writing in Romans 5:3-4, reminds us of something powerful. Tribulation produces perseverance, perseverance character, and character hope. Every difficulty is like a lesson in a heavenly school. Tribulation teaches us to persevere, to continue moving forward even when everything seems against us. This perseverance, in turn, refines who we are, developing a more Christ-like character. And in the end, this character fills us with hope, the certainty that God is in control and that His plan is always good. It is important to understand that adversities are not punishments, but opportunities. They lead us to grow in areas where we might never have developed strength if everything were easy. Just as a tree grows stronger when it faces headwinds, we also grow spiritually when we face life's challenges with faith and confidence. God allows us to go through these situations to equip us for something greater, something that we cannot yet see, but that He has already prepared for us. So when challenges come, instead of asking, "Why me?" ask, "What is God teaching me?" Adversity is a chance to see God's faithfulness in action, to experience His promises up close, and to come out the other side stronger and more prepared for what's to come. Each obstacle overcome is proof that God is working in you, transforming tribulations into testimonies and difficulties into opportunities to manifest His glory. If you are facing difficulties right now, remember that God is on your side. He never abandons us in the midst of battles. Perseverance is not just a virtue, it is a declaration of faith. When we continue to move forward, even when it's difficult, we are telling God that we trust Him and His plans, knowing that the best is yet to come. And after the entire process, silence, patience, perseverance, there is something that God never fails to do: reward faithfulness. He is a just God who honors those who trust in Him and remain faithful in the midst of trials. But it is important to understand that God's reward goes far beyond what we can imagine. It is not limited to the material. It is eternal, transformative, and aligned with the purpose He has for us. David, after years of running from Saul and facing challenges, was finally crowned as King of Israel. His faithfulness in small tasks and his trust in God, even in times of persecution, were rewarded. Not only did he receive the throne, but he also experienced a deep relationship with God, being called a man after God's own heart. David's greatest reward was not power, but intimacy with the Lord. That same promise of reward holds true for us. In Hebrews 11:6, we are reminded that God is a rewarder of those who diligently seek Him. When we remain faithful, even in the midst of the most difficult trials, we are planting seeds that will bear abundant fruit. God sees every tear, every effort, and every step of faith, and He is faithful to honor those who remain in His presence. If you have walked with God, faced challenges, and maintained your faith, know that He is a God of rewards. They may not come at the time or in the form we expect, but they always arrive at the perfect time. Faithfulness is never in vain, because God is faithful in His promises. He turns every trial into victory and every challenge into a testimony to His glory.